So we're going to look at a rather tricky technique called stitching in the ditch. So this technique is commonly used to finish off things like waistbands, collars, cuffs, or any bit of stitching that requires two layers of fabric to sort of sandwich between one layer. So here's an example of where stitch in the ditch has been used to finish off this collar. So you've got the outer layer and the inner layer there. And the outer layer has been attached by stitching right side to right side and then folded upwards to create this collar. Now, what's happened is instead of doing a top stitch to secure the underlayer in, what we've done is stitched in the ditch, which is basically stitched right where that original stitching line was, so that it just catches the underside and leaves you with a really neat top stitch finished on the inside, but no visible stitching on the outside. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. So I have sort of stripped this right back down to basics here. So what we've got here is, let's say, a cuff, imaginary cuff or an imaginary waistband, and we've got the main garment piece here. So we're going to sandwich this between this cuff or waistband. So first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to pin and attach what will be the outer layer of the of this cuff, and I'm going to sew this at a 5/8 seam allowance, which is about 1.5 centimeters. Right, so this has been stitched into position, and then what we're going to do is we're going to press the seam allowances up and over onto this cuff or onto this waistband. We'd obviously spend some time layering any inner layers, but I'm not going to worry about that for the sake of this video. And then we're going to fold that over. Now, what we've got here is a cross section of our waistband or cuff, and you should notice that the seam allowance on the underside, if I were just to put it down a little bit, is exactly the same as the seam allowance on the front, which is 5/8. So what we intend to do is, instead of folding this up at 5/8 so it's exactly on that stitching line, we actually need to reduce the seam allowance just a little bit. So maybe we'll go to 1/2 inch instead. If I measure that out, and the idea is that you have a tiny bit of extra seam allowance just on the underside, so that when you come to stitch in that ditch, you end up picking up all of the fabric on the underside, but the stitching line is almost invisible on the top. So if I were to take this 5/8 seam allowance and reduce it to 1/2 inch, which is the equivalent of about 12 millimeters, then what I can do is then fold it directly over at the halfway mark, and you should hopefully see that all of that stitching is completely covered up, and that if you're looking at the cross section, this back layer is ever so slightly longer than the top layer. So with that in mind, I'm going to give that a really good press to make sure that's absolutely going to cover up all that stitching line. Now, one thing that you will notice is that this is considerably harder around curves and bends, so this is where the practice will come in, but we want to make sure that this is equally distributed. Now, the next thing I would advise anyone to do when stitching in the ditch is to make sure that you have secured this in place. But the problem you've got is if you pin it into position, it tends to distort the underside, and you can't sew from the underside to see if there's any distortion, because you've got to stitch from the top so that you can see where that ditch or that stitching line is. So I would avoid using pins. What you can do is run a tacking stitch in place to secure this fabric, and that 9 times out of 10 means that you end up with a really perfect result. So I'm going to run a little tacking stitch quite close to this edge so that I can then do my stitch in the ditch. Right, so you can see that I've just run a little tacking stitch to keep that in position. So I'm now going to take it to the sewing machine to stitch in the ditch. Okay, so you can absolutely stitch in the ditch using a standard foot. All you need to do is make sure that you are absolutely clear as to where the position of your needle is in relation to the presser foot. So here, if I were to center my needle, this foot has sort of two grooves here, which has an opening which is bang on center. So I'll be able to follow this line quite easily using a standard foot as my guide. Some people like to use a darning foot that tends to be more transparent and sometimes have arrows to assist you, but you can see actually how you'll be able to see where that stitching line will need to go. So your eye line and your focus will be really where this is in relation to the needle. Some people, however, choose to use stitch in the ditch feet, or alternatives are invisible or blind hem feet. So I've got 2 examples of a blind hem foot. So this one here, you can see, has a little divot just here where the needle goes, and it's got a little blade and a rudder. So what you can do is you can make sure that that rudder is running right up against this waistband or cuff seam, and that will allow for the needle to go right into that stitching line, so you end up with a beautiful finish. On slightly more basic machines, this one here is a very standard stitch in the ditch foot, and what you can do is line your needle up where it needs to be, and then position this rudder or the blade so it's running again against this stitching line. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to demonstrate using all 4 techniques, and I'll show you the result. So with all 4 of these feet, I'm going to spend some time positioning the needle. So first of all, you want to absolutely make sure that this is pressed right the way up, and you are sort of pulling that stitching line right out. And then you want to make sure that your needle is positioned right on that line. You don't want it on this side, and you don't want it too far on that side. You want it right in that line, but typically it's just at the very top of the main garment piece. Okay, so now that's positioned, I'm gonna just walk it in, and I'm going to focus my eye on where this part of the fabric is meeting through the middle of the foot. So this is the standard foot. This is the darning foot. And my eye line is here. And this is an invisible hem foot. focus is on this rudder. And this is alternative invisible hem foot. And my eye line is again that rudder. So excusing the tail threads where I've changed the foot, you should be able to see that that stitching line is right up against that original stitching line, or the ditch in this case. You probably wouldn't use a green thread, you'd use the same colour thread as your main garment piece, but this is how it should look on the underside. It should have just caught that seam allowance. So you've got a really cute little overlap there, which is just catching everything in and creating a really beautiful finish. So that is how you understitch.